Emergency management teams conduct a test just to make sure everything is working properly in a dire situation. However, when Adams County conducted a test, they noticed there are major issues with their communication system. Local 4's Leroy Triggs joins us in studio with more.
Brandon, the results show that the current analog radios couldn't make contact with the communication center, but the digital radios could. So along with upgrading radios, the county is looking at creating a backup communication center. They also want to add repeaters to towers around the county because the only tower the county owns is the one next to Hastings Dog Park, which leads to dead zones in certain parts of Adams County. The most prominent areas are northwest and southwest Adams County. County Commissioner Michael Schromer says there are times police officers are using cell phone communication instead of radios. New equipment will solve a major issue.
Specifically, one of the areas we're going to address is being able to communicate with State Patrol because they are an outside agency who would respond in situations like the active shooter over in Juniata and that. And this will add that capability in.
Schromer says during the active shooter situation, it simply came down to the Sheriff's Department not having adequate communication equipment. Schromer says that new equipment will improve response times and even in places that were considered dead zones. And expanding the tower network is something they're also focusing on. The county has a deal with Viero to utilize at least 4 towers. Brandon, back to you.
Thank you very much, Leroy.